Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform one last time before entering the imposing oak-paneled conference room at Fort Harrison Military Academy. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table where 5 senior officers sat reviewing her file. At 28, she was younger than most instructors applying for the advanced combat training position, but her credentials spoke volumes about her capabilities. Colonel James Richardson, a man whose gray mustache had witnessed 3 decades of military service, looked up from her paperwork with skeptical eyes. His reputation preceded him, a traditionalist who believed that certain roles required certain types of people. The other officers, Major Thompson, Captain Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Walker, and Major Brooks, maintained neutral expressions as they waited for the interview to begin. Sarah had prepared for this moment for months. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, she had transitioned to training new recruits in battlefield medicine and tactical response. Her success rate was impressive. 93% of soldiers she trained passed their advanced certifications on the first attempt, compared to the academy average of 76%. The position she sought was prestigious and challenging. The advanced combat training instructor would be responsible for preparing elite units for deployment to the world's most dangerous regions. It required someone who could teach not just technical skills, but also the mental fortitude necessary to survive in hostile environments. The academy had never appointed someone so young to this role, and certainly never someone who looked like Sarah. Colonel Richardson cleared his throat and began the formal questioning. Her responses were crisp and professional as she outlined her teaching methodology, her approach to stress inoculation training, and her philosophy on preparing soldiers for the psychological challenges of combat. She spoke about creating realistic training scenarios that would prepare troops for the chaos and unpredictability they would face in actual combat situations. When asked about her experience with explosive devices, Sarah detailed her time working with bomb disposal units in Kandahar province. She described the meticulous process of training soldiers to recognize improvised explosive devices, the importance of maintaining composure under pressure, and the critical decision-making skills required when lives hung in the balance. Her knowledge was comprehensive, her delivery confident. However, as the interview progressed, Colonel Richardson's questions became increasingly pointed. He questioned whether someone of her stature could command the respect of seasoned soldiers. He wondered aloud if she possessed the necessary gravitas to train men and women who had already seen combat. His tone suggested that he found her credentials impressive on paper, but doubted their real-world application. Sarah maintained her composure, answering each question with detailed examples from her service record. She spoke about leading medical teams under fire, making split-second decisions that saved lives, and earning the respect of hardened infantry soldiers who initially questioned her presence on the battlefield. Her voice remained steady even as the questions became more challenging. The turning point came when Colonel Richardson leaned back in his chair and posed what he clearly considered the decisive question. He asked her to explain how she would handle a situation where experienced soldiers questioned her authority or refused to take her training seriously. It was a scenario that had obviously played out in his mind, and his expression suggested he already knew her answer would be inadequate. Sarah began her response by acknowledging that respect in the military, like anywhere else, had to be earned rather than simply demanded. She explained her strategy of leading by example, demonstrating competence before expecting compliance. She talked about the importance of understanding each soldier's background and finding ways to connect with them on a professional level. But as she spoke, she could see the doubt in Colonel Richardson's eyes growing stronger. He interrupted her mid-sentence, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He stated flatly that theoretical knowledge and academic success were fine for classroom settings, but real combat training required someone who had truly been tested under fire. He suggested that while her service record was commendable, it lacked the kind of intense combat experience that would give her the credibility needed for this position. The other officers shifted uncomfortably as the colonel continued his assessment. He pointed out that the soldiers she would be training were not fresh recruits but experienced warriors who had already proven themselves in battle. They would need an instructor who could match their level of experience and command their immediate respect. His implication was clear. He believed Sarah lacked the necessary combat credentials despite her impressive service record. Sarah felt her frustration building but maintained her professional demeanor. She began to respond, explaining that her role as a combat medic had placed her in the thick of numerous firefights and dangerous situations. She described treating wounded soldiers while under enemy fire, coordinating evacuations in hostile territory, and working alongside special operations teams in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. Colonel Richardson waved dismissively at her explanation. He argued that being present during combat and actually leading combat operations were entirely different experiences. He questioned whether someone who had primarily focused on medical duties could truly understand the mindset and needs of soldiers whose primary job was engaging the enemy directly. His tone became increasingly condescending as he suggested that her perspective, while valuable, was limited by the nature of her previous roles. The room fell silent as Sarah processed his words. She had encountered this type of dismissal before, but never quite so directly or in such an important setting. The other officers looked uncomfortable but said nothing, allowing Colonel Richardson to continue his assessment unchallenged. The weight of his skepticism filled the room, threatening to derail everything she had worked toward. Sarah realized that her carefully prepared responses and impressive credentials were not going to be enough to convince this man of her capabilities. He had already made up his mind based on assumptions about what kind of person could effectively fill this role. The evidence of her competence and success meant nothing in the face of his preconceived notions about who belonged in positions of authority and respect. As the silence stretched on, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of not just this interview, but her entire career. She knew that words alone would never be sufficient to overcome the colonel's skepticism. Sometimes, the most powerful arguments were not spoken but revealed through the evidence written on one's own body by the harsh realities of combat experience. Sarah took a deep breath and began to unbutton the top of her dress uniform jacket. The movement was deliberate and purposeful, causing the officers around the table to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Colonel Richardson's eyebrows rose in surprise at this unexpected turn in the interview proceedings. The formal military setting made such an action highly unusual, but something in Sarah's expression indicated this was not an impulsive decision. As she carefully folded back the left side of her jacket and then her shirt, a network of scars became visible across her shoulder and upper chest. These were not the clean surgical scars that might result from routine medical procedures. Instead, they were the irregular, jagged marks left by explosive shrapnel, dozens of small puncture wounds that had healed into permanent reminders of a day that had changed her life forever. The room fell completely silent. Major Thompson, who had been taking notes throughout the interview, set down his pen and stared. Captain Davis leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from mild interest to focused attention. Lieutenant Colonel Walker and Major Brooks exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their reassessment of the young woman sitting before them. Even Colonel Richardson, despite his decades of military experience, seemed momentarily speechless. Sarah's voice was calm and steady as she began to speak, her eyes never leaving Colonel Richardson's face. She explained that these scars were souvenirs from a mission in Afghanistan's Helmand province, where she had been embedded with an infantry unit conducting routine patrol operations in a known hostile area. The mission had seemed straightforward: establish security in a village that had been recently cleared of Taliban fighters and provide medical support to both military personnel and local civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of recent conflicts. The village of Musa Kala had been the site of intense fighting for months before their unit arrived. Intelligence reports suggested that most enemy combatants had withdrawn to more defensible positions in the surrounding mountains, but the reality on the ground proved far more complicated. Local civilians were afraid to provide accurate information about remaining threats, torn between fear of coalition forces and terror of Taliban retribution for any perceived cooperation with foreign troops. Sarah had set up a temporary medical station in what had once been the village school. The building offered good sight lines and multiple exit routes, standard considerations for any forward operating medical post. Her team consisted of 2 other medics and a communications specialist, while the main infantry unit established a perimeter and conducted house-to-house searches for weapons caches and intelligence materials. The morning had started quietly, with Sarah treating minor injuries among the soldiers and providing basic medical care to several village children, whose families had finally felt safe enough to approach the coalition forces. She remembered the mixture of curiosity and fear in their eyes as she cleaned cuts and administered basic medications. Despite the language barrier, the universal nature of medical care had created a small pocket of human connection in the midst of the broader conflict. Around midday, the situation began to deteriorate rapidly. Lookouts posted on nearby rooftops reported movement in the hills surrounding the village, and radio chatter indicated that a larger group of insurgents than expected had remained in the area. The unit commander made the decision to accelerate their operations and prepare for possible evacuation if the tactical situation became untenable. Sarah was in the process of packing her medical supplies when the first explosion rocked the building. The blast came from outside the village perimeter, suggesting that insurgents were attempting to cut off potential escape routes rather than directly assault their position. This was a sophisticated tactic that indicated they were facing experienced fighters rather than opportunistic attackers. The second explosion was closer, and Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Her training immediately kicked in as she shouted for everyone in the medical station to take cover against the interior walls, away from windows and potential entry points for shrapnel. The communications specialist was frantically calling for air support while trying to coordinate with the infantry units scattered throughout the village. What followed was a concentrated artillery barrage that demonstrated the enemy's knowledge of their positions and movements. The insurgents had clearly been watching the coalition forces since their arrival, mapping their locations and planning a coordinated attack designed to inflict maximum casualties. The intensity of the bombardment suggested they had access to more sophisticated weapons than typically encountered in rural Afghan villages. Sarah found herself treating wounded soldiers while artillery rounds continued to fall around their position. She worked with mechanical precision, applying tourniquets, starting IV lines, and administering pain medication, while her mind calculated evacuation procedures and prioritized casualties based on the severity of their injuries. The chaos around her became background noise as she focused entirely on saving lives. The explosion that changed everything came without warning. One moment she was bandaging a soldier's leg wound, and the next she was lying on the floor with her ears ringing and warm liquid running down her chest. The mortar round had struck the roof of the school building, sending deadly fragments of metal and concrete throughout the room where her medical station had been operating. In the immediate aftermath, Sarah's medical training overrode her personal assessment of her own injuries. She could feel that something was wrong with her shoulder and chest. But her first priority was accounting for the other people in the room and providing immediate care to anyone who had been more seriously wounded. The communications specialist had been knocked unconscious but was breathing, while one of her fellow medics was struggling to stop bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds. It was only when she tried to lift her left arm to reach for her medical kit that Sarah realized the extent of her own injuries. Sharp fragments had penetrated her uniform and embedded themselves in her shoulder, chest, and upper arm. Each movement sent waves of pain through her body, but adrenaline and professional responsibility kept her functioning despite the trauma her body had sustained. The evacuation that followed was a masterpiece of military coordination under fire. Helicopter support arrived within minutes, providing covering fire while ground units fought their way to the school building. Sarah continued to work on other wounded soldiers even as medics tried to treat her own injuries, refusing evacuation until all other casualties had been stabilized and transported to safety. The recovery process had been longer and more complicated than anyone initially expected. At the field hospital in Kandahar, doctors had to carefully remove 17 pieces of shrapnel from Sarah's shoulder and chest area. Some fragments had lodged dangerously close to major blood vessels and nerve clusters, requiring delicate surgical procedures to extract them without causing permanent damage to her mobility or sensation. During the weeks of recovery that followed, Sarah had time to reflect on what the experience had taught her about combat, leadership, and the unpredictable nature of warfare. Lying in a hospital bed thousands of miles from home, she began to understand aspects of military service that no classroom instruction could have conveyed: the weight of responsibility for other people's lives, the split-second decision-making required in life-or-death situations, and the profound bond that forms between soldiers who have shared extreme danger together. Physical therapy was grueling, but necessary. Sarah had to relearn how to use her left arm effectively, working through pain and stiffness that reminded her daily of that afternoon in Musa Qala. The doctors warned her that she might never regain full range of motion in her shoulder, potentially ending her military career before she had achieved her long-term goals. This possibility motivated her to push harder during rehabilitation, determined not to let her injuries define the limits of her future service. More challenging than the physical recovery was processing the psychological impact of the attack. Sarah found herself startled by sudden loud noises, hyper-alert in crowded spaces, and plagued by vivid dreams that replayed different versions of that day. The military's mental health resources helped her understand that these reactions were normal responses to trauma, not signs of weakness or failure. Working through these challenges made her more empathetic to the struggles that other combat veterans faced when returning from deployment. When she finally returned to duty 6 months later, Sarah discovered that her perspective on military training had been fundamentally changed. She approached her teaching responsibilities with a deeper understanding of what soldiers actually needed to survive in combat situations. Her lesson plans became more focused on practical skills and psychological preparation, rather than theoretical knowledge. She incorporated stress inoculation exercises that helped trainees learn to function effectively, despite fear, confusion, and physical discomfort. Her reputation as an instructor began to grow as soldiers who had trained under her consistently performed well in actual combat situations. They reported feeling better prepared for the chaos and unpredictability of real firefights because her training scenarios had exposed them to similar challenges in controlled environments. Word spread throughout the military, education community about her innovative approaches to combat training and her unusually high success rates. The scars on her shoulder and chest became conversation starters rather than sources of self-consciousness. During training exercises, when soldiers questioned whether a particular scenario was realistic, Sarah could point to her own experience as evidence that even the most careful planning could not account for every possible danger. Her credibility was written on her body in a way that no amount of academic credentials could match. As she continued to tell her story to the officers in that conference room, Sarah watched their expressions carefully. Colonel Richardson's initial skepticism was giving way to something that looked like grudging respect. The other officers were leaning forward now, clearly engaged by the detailed account of her combat experience. She could see them processing the implications of what she was sharing. This was not someone who had merely been present during combat operations, but someone who had continued to function and lead under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Sarah explained how the experience had shaped her understanding of what made an effective combat leader. It was not about being the strongest or the loudest person in the room, but about maintaining clarity of thought and purpose when everything around you was falling apart. She had learned that respect in combat situations was earned through competence under pressure, not through rank or intimidation. Soldiers followed leaders who demonstrated the ability to make good decisions when lives were at stake, regardless of their background or appearance. The story she told was not one of individual heroism, but of the complex teamwork required to survive and succeed in hostile environments. She emphasized how her medical training had given her a unique perspective on combat operations. She had seen the consequences of poor tactical decisions in the wounded soldiers she treated, and she understood the importance of thorough preparation in preventing avoidable casualties. This experience made her a more effective instructor because she could connect tactical concepts to their real-world implications. Colonel Richardson interrupted her narrative to ask about specific details of the engagement. His questions revealed a professional curiosity that had replaced his earlier dismissiveness. He wanted to know about the insurgents' tactical approach, the effectiveness of different weapon systems, and the lessons learned from the incident. Sarah answered each question with the detailed knowledge of someone who had not just survived the experience but had analyzed it thoroughly to extract useful insights for future operations. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had occurred during the formal interview portion of their meeting. The officers began discussing combat scenarios and training methodologies with Sarah as an equal participant rather than a candidate being evaluated. They shared their own experiences and asked for her opinions on various tactical approaches. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely from skeptical evaluation to professional consultation. Major Thompson asked about her approach to training soldiers who had never been in combat before. Sarah explained that her experience had taught her the importance of mental preparation alongside physical and technical training. She described exercises designed to simulate the sensory overload and decision-making pressure of actual combat, helping trainees develop the cognitive skills they would need when their lives depended on quick thinking and accurate assessment of rapidly changing situations. Captain Davis was particularly interested in her insights about medical training for non-medical personnel. Sarah outlined her philosophy that every soldier should possess enough medical knowledge to keep themselves and their teammates alive until professional help could arrive. Her own experience of continuing to function while wounded had reinforced her belief that medical training was not a specialized skill but a basic survival requirement for anyone operating in hostile environments. Lieutenant Colonel Walker asked about her recommendations for improving the Academy's current training programs. Sarah had clearly given this considerable thought, outlining specific suggestions for making training scenarios more realistic and psychologically challenging. She emphasized the importance of creating training environments that forced students to confront their own limitations and learn to function effectively despite fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. As the discussion continued, it became clear that Sarah's combat experience had given her insights that complemented, rather than competed with, the knowledge and experience of the senior officers around the table. Her perspective was unique not because it was superior to theirs, but because it had been shaped by different circumstances and challenges that had forced her to develop different solutions to common military problems. As Sarah carefully buttoned her uniform back up, covering the scars that had spoken more eloquently than any words could have, the dynamic in the room had completely transformed. Colonel Richardson was no longer the skeptical interviewer challenging her qualifications, but a fellow military professional seeking to understand how her unique experiences could benefit the Academy's training programs. The other officers were engaged in a way that suggested they saw her not as a candidate to be evaluated, but as a colleague whose insights they valued. Major Brooks, who had remained largely silent throughout the earlier part of the interview, began asking detailed questions about Sarah's approach to stress inoculation training. He was particularly interested in how she balanced the need to prepare soldiers for extreme situations while avoiding unnecessary psychological trauma during training exercises. Sarah's response demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human psychology under stress, drawing from both her medical background and her personal experience of functioning under extreme pressure. The conversation evolved into a collaborative discussion about the future of military training. Sarah outlined her vision for a more integrated approach that combined traditional tactical instruction with modern insights from psychology, medicine, and cognitive science. She spoke about the importance of teaching soldiers not just what to do in various situations, but how to think clearly and make effective decisions when their normal thought processes were disrupted by fear, pain, or sensory overload. Colonel Richardson found himself genuinely curious about her perspectives on leadership development. He had initially assumed that her relative youth and unconventional background would limit her ability to command respect from experienced soldiers, but her account of maintaining medical operations while under direct fire had challenged his assumptions completely. He asked her to elaborate on how she had learned to lead effectively in such extreme circumstances. Sarah's answer revealed the depth of thought she had given to this question. She explained that effective leadership in combat situations required a different skill set than leadership in peacetime military operations. When people's lives were immediately at risk, followers needed to trust that their leader possessed both the technical competence to make correct decisions and the emotional stability to remain calm under pressure. Rank and position meant nothing if soldiers did not believe their leader could keep them alive. She described how her role as a combat medic had required her to take charge of chaotic medical situations involving people who outranked her significantly. Wounded soldiers did not care about hierarchy when they were bleeding. They needed someone who could stop the bleeding, manage their pain, and coordinate their evacuation. Learning to assert medical authority in these situations had taught her that true leadership was about taking responsibility for outcomes rather than demanding deference based on position. The officers were fascinated by her insights into the psychological aspects of combat performance. Sarah described how her medical training had given her a unique perspective on the relationship between physical and mental performance under stress. She had observed that soldiers who received better psychological preparation for combat situations were less likely to suffer severe injuries, not because they were braver, but because they were able to think more clearly and make better tactical decisions when under pressure. This observation had significant implications for training methodology. Rather than focusing primarily on physical conditioning and weapon proficiency, Sarah advocated for training programs that systematically exposed soldiers to the kinds of psychological stressors they would encounter in actual combat. She described specific exercises designed to simulate the disorientation, fear, and decision-making pressure that characterized real firefights, helping trainees develop the mental resilience they would need to survive and succeed in hostile environments. Lieutenant Colonel Walker was particularly interested in her thoughts about adapting training programs for different types of military operations. Sarah explained that her experience had taught her that the psychological demands of different mission types varied significantly. Medical evacuation operations required different mental skills than direct assault missions, and training programs needed to account for these differences to be truly effective. The discussion turned to the specific challenges facing the advanced combat training program that Sarah was hoping to lead. The officers explained that recent graduates had been reporting difficulties translating their training experiences into effective performance in actual combat situations. Despite receiving technically excellent instruction, some soldiers were struggling with the psychological transition from controlled training environments to the chaos and unpredictability of real military operations. Sarah's response demonstrated that she had anticipated this challenge and developed specific strategies to address it. She outlined her plans for creating training scenarios that deliberately introduced elements of unpredictability and chaos, forcing trainees to adapt their plans in real time based on changing circumstances. Her goal was to create training environments that were psychologically similar to actual combat situations, even if they could not perfectly replicate the physical dangers involved. Colonel Richardson asked about her approach to working with soldiers who had already seen combat and were attending the advanced training as part of their professional development. This was a sophisticated question that revealed his growing respect for her judgment. Sarah acknowledged that teaching experienced combat veterans required a different approach than training new recruits, but argued that even experienced soldiers could benefit from exposure to different perspectives and techniques. She explained that her own experience had taught her the value of continuous learning and adaptation. Every combat situation was unique, and what worked in one environment might not be effective in another. Advanced training should challenge experienced soldiers to expand their tactical repertoire and develop new approaches to familiar problems. Her role would not be to replace their existing knowledge, but to help them build upon it and adapt it to new challenges. The conversation continued for much longer than anyone had anticipated. What had begun as a formal job interview had evolved into a professional consultation session where Sarah's insights were being actively sought and valued. The officers found themselves taking notes on her suggestions and asking for more detailed explanations of her training methodologies. It was clear that they were no longer questioning whether she was qualified for the position, but rather how quickly they could implement her ideas. As the discussion drew toward a close, Colonel Richardson's demeanor had undergone a complete transformation. The skeptical authority figure who had questioned her credentials at the beginning of the interview had been replaced by a colleague who clearly respected her expertise and valued her perspective. His questions were no longer challenges, but genuine requests for information and advice from someone whose experience had proven more extensive and relevant than he had initially recognized. The other officers were equally engaged, asking final questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements for the training modifications Sarah had proposed. It was evident that they were already thinking about how to integrate her approaches into the Academy's existing programs, treating her not as a prospective employee, but as a consultant whose recommendations they were eager to implement. 3 weeks after the interview, Sarah received the call that would define the next phase of her military career. Colonel Richardson's voice on the other end of the line was warm and professional as he informed her that the selection committee had unanimously chosen her for the advanced combat training position. More importantly, He explained that they wanted to implement many of her suggested training modifications immediately, giving her significant latitude to reshape the program according to her vision. The appointment made headlines within military education circles. Sarah became the youngest person ever appointed to lead the Advanced Combat Training Program at Fort Harrison, and her selection represented a significant shift in the Academy's approach to combat preparation. News of her appointment spread quickly through military networks, generating interest from other training institutions that wanted to learn about her innovative methodologies. Sarah's first months in the position were intense and demanding. She inherited a program that had been operating according to established protocols for decades, and implementing significant changes required careful planning and diplomatic skill. Some instructors were initially skeptical of modifications proposed by someone they viewed as an outsider, but Sarah's approach of leading by example and demonstrating the effectiveness of her methods gradually won over even the most resistant staff members. The new training scenarios she developed were unlike anything the Academy had previously implemented. Rather than following predictable scripts, her exercises incorporated random elements that forced trainees to adapt continuously to changing circumstances. She used professional actors to play civilian roles in training scenarios, creating emotionally complex situations that challenged soldiers to make difficult decisions under pressure while maintaining their humanity and ethical standards. One of her most innovative contributions was the integration of medical emergency scenarios into all training exercises. Every simulation now included wounded personnel who required immediate care, forcing trainees to balance tactical objectives with medical priorities. This approach reflected her understanding that combat operations always involved medical considerations, and that soldiers who understood these connections made better tactical decisions overall. The psychological component of her training program was equally revolutionary. Sarah brought in mental health professionals to help design exercises that would expose trainees to controlled versions of the psychological stressors they would encounter in actual combat. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs of combat stress in themselves and their teammates, and developed practical techniques for maintaining mental clarity under extreme pressure. Her reputation continued to grow as reports filtered back from the field about the superior performance of soldiers who had completed her training program. Units that included graduates of Sarah's courses reported lower casualty rates, better tactical decision-making under pressure, and improved ability to adapt to unexpected situations. These results provided concrete validation of her approach and led to requests from military leadership for expanded implementation of her training methods. Colonel Richardson became one of her strongest advocates, frequently citing her program as an example of innovative thinking that improved real-world military effectiveness. His initial skepticism had been completely replaced by professional admiration for her ability to translate personal experience into systematic training improvements. He often mentioned how her willingness to share her combat experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of what qualifications were most important for military instructors. The transformation in Colonel Richardson's attitude became a case study in how preconceived notions could blind even experienced leaders to valuable perspectives and capabilities. His initial dismissal of Sarah's qualifications had been based on assumptions about age, appearance, and traditional career paths that had nothing to do with her actual ability to perform the job effectively. The dramatic reversal in his assessment served as a powerful reminder about the importance of evidence-based evaluation over superficial judgments. Sarah's success also highlighted the value of diverse perspectives in military education. Her background as a combat medic had given her insights into warfare that complemented rather than competed with traditional infantry experience. Her medical training had taught her to think systematically about human performance under stress, while her combat experience had shown her how theoretical knowledge translated into practical application under extreme conditions. The story of her interview and subsequent success began to circulate within military education communities as an example of how personal experience could provide unique qualifications that were not captured by traditional credential requirements. Training institutions began to reconsider their selection criteria, placing greater emphasis on demonstrated performance under stress and the ability to translate experience into effective teaching methodologies. Sarah's approach to training development became a model for other military education programs. Her emphasis on psychological preparation, adaptability, and integrated medical awareness influenced training protocols throughout the military education system. Officers from other institutions visited Fort Harrison to observe her programs and learn about implementation strategies they could adapt for their own contexts. The impact of her work extended beyond immediate training improvements. Soldiers who completed her programs carried her methodologies with them to their next assignments, spreading her influence throughout the broader military community. Her emphasis on mental resilience and adaptive thinking began to influence military culture at levels far beyond the training academy where she worked. As her reputation grew, Sarah was invited to speak at military conferences and professional development seminars. Her presentations always included the story of her interview with Colonel Richardson, using it to illustrate the importance of looking beyond traditional qualifications to identify true expertise. She emphasized that valuable insights could come from unexpected sources, and that effective leadership required the humility to recognize and acknowledge superior knowledge, regardless of its source. The scars on her shoulder, which had initially been sources of self-consciousness, became symbols of her credibility and expertise. During training exercises, when students questioned the realism of particularly challenging scenarios, instructors would reference Sarah's experience as evidence that even the most extreme training situations were based on actual combat realities. Her personal story became part of the institutional knowledge that gave the Academy's training programs their reputation for effectiveness. Years later, Colonel Richardson would often tell the story of Sarah's interview as an example of how his own biases had nearly caused him to overlook exceptional talent. He described how her willingness to share her combat experience had not only demonstrated her qualifications, but had also taught him valuable lessons about leadership, judgment, and the importance of evidence over assumptions. The incident had become a defining moment in his own development as a leader and evaluator of military personnel. The lasting impact of that interview extended far beyond Sarah's individual career success. It became a catalyst for broader changes in how the military identified and developed talent, with greater emphasis placed on demonstrated performance and innovative thinking, rather than traditional career paths and conventional credentials. 5 years after that transformative interview, Sarah stood before a new group of senior officers at the Pentagon, this time as the invited expert rather than the candidate seeking approval. The conference room was filled with military education leaders from across all service branches, gathered to discuss the implementation of her training methodologies on a national scale. Her reputation had grown to the point where her insights were actively sought by the highest levels of military leadership. The presentation she delivered that day drew heavily on the lessons learned from her years at Fort Harrison. She spoke about the importance of realistic training scenarios, the value of psychological preparation, and the need for military education to evolve continuously based on actual combat experience. Her audience listened intently as she outlined specific modifications that had proven effective in reducing casualty rates and improving mission success rates among trained units. During the question and answer session following her presentation, a young captain raised her hand to ask about overcoming skepticism from senior officers who questioned unconventional approaches to military training. Sarah smiled as she recognized the familiar challenge, remembering her own struggle to gain credibility with Colonel Richardson years earlier. Her response emphasized the importance of concrete results over theoretical arguments, and the need to demonstrate value through measurable improvements in training outcomes. The captain's question prompted Sarah to share the story of her own interview experience, describing how she had overcome initial skepticism by providing evidence of her combat experience rather than relying solely on verbal arguments. She explained how the revelation of her shrapnel scars had transformed the dynamic of that conversation, not because of their dramatic impact, but because they represented tangible proof of her qualifications that could not be dismissed or questioned. The room fell silent as Sarah described the moment, when she had decided to show her scars to Colonel Richardson and the other officers. Many of the senior leaders present had their own combat experiences and understood the significance of such visible evidence of service under fire. They recognized that her decision to share such personal proof of her qualifications had required both courage and strategic thinking about how to communicate her value effectively. As Sarah concluded her presentation, the commanding general who had organized the conference stood to address the audience. He announced that Sarah's training methodologies would be implemented across all military education institutions within the next 2 years, representing the largest systematic change in military training protocols in decades. Her individual success story had evolved into a transformation of how the entire military approached combat preparation. The general's announcement was met with sustained applause from the audience, but Sarah's thoughts returned to that conference room at Fort Harrison, where her career had taken its decisive turn. She thought about Colonel Richardson, who had since become a close colleague and advocate for her work. His willingness to acknowledge his initial misjudgment and embrace her contributions had demonstrated the kind of leadership, flexibility that made organizational progress possible. Following the Pentagon meeting, Sarah received numerous offers from other military institutions and private defense contractors seeking to benefit from her expertise. However, she chose to remain at Fort Harrison, where she could continue developing and refining her training approaches while mentoring the next generation of military educators. Her decision reflected her commitment to long-term institutional improvement rather than personal advancement. The impact of her work extended beyond American military institutions. International allies began sending officers to train under her programs, and she was invited to consult on training modifications for military forces around the world. Her methodologies were adapted for different cultural contexts and operational environments, demonstrating the universal applicability of her insights about human performance under stress. Sarah's story became required reading in military leadership courses, used as an example of how personal experience could be translated into systematic improvements that benefited entire organizations. The case study examined not only her individual journey from skepticism to recognition, but also the broader lessons about talent identification, bias recognition, and the importance of evidence-based decision-making in organizational settings. Years later, when Sarah was promoted to colonel herself, she made sure that her own selection processes avoided the biases that had initially limited her own opportunities. She implemented evaluation criteria that emphasized demonstrated performance over traditional credentials, and she trained her staff to recognize valuable expertise regardless of its source or presentation. Her commitment to fair evaluation became legendary within military education circles. Colonel Richardson, now nearing retirement, often visited Sarah's programs to observe the continued evolution of training methodologies. During one such visit, he pulled her aside to reflect on their first meeting and its lasting impact on his own leadership philosophy. He admitted that his initial skepticism had been rooted in outdated assumptions about what military expertise looked like, and he credited their interaction with teaching him to value substance over superficial impressions. Their conversation that day highlighted how much both of their careers had been shaped by that pivotal interview. Richardson's willingness to acknowledge his misjudgment and embrace Sarah's contributions had enhanced his own reputation as a leader who could recognize and develop talent effectively. His evolution from skeptic to advocate had become a model for other senior officers learning to identify valuable expertise in unexpected forms. Sarah's influence extended far beyond her immediate circle of colleagues and students. The soldiers who had trained under her programs carried her methodologies to units around the world, creating a ripple effect that improved military effectiveness across multiple theaters of operation. Her emphasis on psychological resilience and adaptive thinking became integral to military culture, influencing how soldiers approached challenges both in combat and in peacetime operations. The training academy at Fort Harrison had become a destination for military education professionals from around the globe, all seeking to understand and implement Sarah's innovative approaches. Her programs were studied, adapted, and replicated in contexts far beyond their original scope, demonstrating the universal applicability of her insights about human performance under extreme stress. As Sarah reflected on her journey from that nervous candidate in the interview room to her current position as a recognized expert in military education, she remained grateful for the moment when she had decided to show her scars, rather than continue relying solely on verbal arguments. That decision had not only secured her position, but had also demonstrated the power of authentic evidence over conventional credentials. The scars themselves had faded somewhat over the years, but their significance as symbols of her expertise had only grown. They represented not just her personal experience of combat, but also her ability to transform that experience into systematic improvements that benefited countless others. Her story had become proof that valuable contributions could come from any source, and that true leadership required the wisdom to recognize and embrace diverse forms of expertise. In her final years of military service, Sarah established a foundation dedicated to improving combat training methodologies and supporting veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The Foundation's work continued her commitment to translating combat experience into practical applications that served broader communities. Her legacy extended far beyond her individual achievements to encompass systemic changes that would benefit future generations of military personnel. The interview room at Fort Harrison, where her career had taken its decisive turn, was eventually renamed in her honor, serving as a reminder to future selection committees about the importance of looking beyond conventional qualifications to identify true expertise. A small plaque near the door quoted her words from that transformative day. "Sometimes the most powerful arguments are not spoken, but revealed through the evidence written on our bodies by experience." Sarah's story became a testament to the power of perseverance, authenticity, and the courage to reveal one's true qualifications when conventional measures proved inadequate. Her journey from skepticism to recognition illustrated how individual determination could create lasting institutional change, and how personal experience, when properly applied, could benefit entire organizations and communities. The lasting impact of that single interview continued to influence military culture decades later, serving as a powerful reminder that expertise comes in many forms, and that effective leadership requires the humility to recognize superior knowledge, regardless of its source. Sarah's willingness to share her story ensured that future generations would benefit from the lessons learned through her courage to show her scars and transform skepticism into respect through the undeniable power of lived experience.